a dark Finnish lake lies silent in the cold summer night. 4 teenagers vanished into the eerie darkness beside its still black water. By dawn, the horror was complete. 3 teenagers were slaughtered in a tent at the dark lakeside at dawn. The only survivor woke up alone in the cold morning light, covered in blood, with no memory of what had happened in the dark. 64 years later, no one has ever been charged with the murders at Lake Bodom, Finland, a cold and haunting summer night in 1960. Lake Bodom, a stretch of dark, still water buried deep in a silent pine forest 20 kilometers west of Helsinki. In summer, young people disappeared into the dark trees to camp beside the eerie black water. It was Finland at its most deceptively peaceful, beautiful forests hiding unknown darkness. On the cold night of June 4th, 4 teenagers pitched a small tent on the isolated dark shore. The dark lake was still. The silent forest was empty. No one was watching. They had food. They had each other. The cold black water of Lake Bodom was silent around them. No one came to check on them in the dark, isolated forest. No one heard anything from the abandoned shore. Until the cold grey dawn broke over the dark water. 4 teenagers, 2 couples spending a summer night in the isolated Finnish forest. Niels Wilhelm Gustafsson, 18 years old, camping beside the dark lake with his friends. His girlfriend Maila Björklund, 15 years old, sleeping in the dark tent that cold night. Their friends Seppo Antero Boisman and Anja Maki, both teenagers, camping in the silent pine forest beside the black water. It was the beginning of the dark Finnish summer. They drove through the empty forest roads to the isolated dark shore of Lake Bodom. They set up their small tent on the cold ground beside the still black water. The dark forest surrounded them. The silent lake lay still. The night was quiet and cold. Nobody came to find them in the isolated darkness. Nobody heard any sounds from the abandoned shore that night. Until the cold grey morning arrived. On the cold grey morning of June 5th, a man walking past the dark, isolated shore of Lake Bodom noticed the collapsed tent. Something was terribly wrong in the eerie morning silence. The canvas tent had been slashed open from the outside, torn apart in the darkness. Inside the destroyed tent in the cold morning light, 3 bodies lay in the horror. Maila, Seppo and Anja had been beaten and stabbed with ferocious violence in the darkness. The brutal injuries found at the dark crime scene were described by investigators as ferocious, far beyond what was necessary to kill. Seppo Boisman had been struck with such violent force in the darkness that investigators initially could not determine the cause of death. Maila Björklund, 15 years old, found stabbed and beaten at the dark lakeside crime scene. Anja Maki, also just 15 years old, found in the same horrifying condition in the cold morning. Outside the collapsed tent in the cold grey dawn, a figure lay silent on the dark ground. Niels Gustafsson lay on top of the torn canvas in the eerie morning cold, alive. His body was covered in blood in the cold morning light. His jaw was broken. Several teeth were missing. He had suffered serious injuries in the dark horror, but he was alive at the isolated dark lakeside. When the Finnish police arrived at the eerie crime scene on the dark, silent shore, Niels could tell them almost nothing about what had happened in the night. He had no memory of the attack that had occurred in the darkness. Finnish police arrived at the dark, isolated shore of Lake Bodom and began the largest forensic investigation in Finnish history. What the cold, silent lake gave up, and what it kept hidden in its dark depth, would define this haunting, unsolved case for 60 years. The canvas tent had been slashed from the outside, meaning the attacker had stood in the cold, dark forest outside while the teenagers slept. The sleeping victims had no time to escape the horror in the darkness. They had no chance to run from the eerie, silent attacker. 2 children near the dark, isolated shore reported seeing a blonde figure running away through the dark pine forest at dawn. The eerie description was too vague. The mysterious figure in the dark forest was never identified. Forensic evidence at the cold crime scene showed both a bladed weapon and a blunt instrument had been used in the horror. Either one attacker carried 2 weapons through the dark forest, or there were 2 murderers hiding in the darkness. No murder weapon was ever recovered from the cold, dark lake or surrounding forest. No fingerprints, no reliable witness to the horror. No clear motive for the dark crime. The dark, cold Lake of Bodom had given up the dead, but it kept its terrifying secrets hidden in its black depths. 3 dark and mysterious suspects emerged from the shadows over the following 6 haunting decades. The morning after the horror at Lake Bodom, a mysterious man named Hans Assmann arrived at a dark Helsinki hospital corridor in a deeply disturbed state. His clothes were stained with what appeared to be blood from the dark night. His fingernails were black with the unknown substance. He was incoherent in the cold hospital corridor. Hans Assmann was a German-born man with a deeply mysterious and shadowy background. Some investigators believed he had dark connections to the Soviet KGB intelligence agency. He'd been seen near the dark, isolated shore of Lake Bodom on the night of the murders. The mysterious man was questioned by police. He claimed a dark alibi. He was never charged with the horror. Hans Assmann died in the shadows years later, taking whatever dark secrets he knew about that cold night to his grave. Valdemar Gillstrom operated a dark and abandoned kiosk near the isolated shore of Lake Bodom. Local people described him as volatile, deeply aggressive, and unsettling, like a dark figure lurking in the forest shadows. He reportedly hated the young people who came to disturb the dark, silent lake with their camping. Some investigators believe Gillstrom had snapped in the darkness and unleashed his violent rage on the 4 teenagers in the cold night. Before Finnish police could formally question this dark suspect, Valdemar Gillstrom drowned in a cold, dark lake. It was ruled an accident in the silence. Whether it truly was, no one has ever confirmed in the darkness of the investigation. He disappeared into the dark, cold water and never answered a single question about that horrifying night. The third suspect to emerge from the shadows was the lone survivor himself, Niels Gustafsson, the sole survivor. Niels Gustafsson rebuilt his quiet life after the horror at Lake Bodom. He retreated from the darkness. He married. He had children. He worked quietly. He lived in silence as a man who had survived the darkest night of his life. For 40 long years, he was never considered a suspect in the dark horror. Then, in 2004, Finnish investigators reopened the cold, unsolved case from the dark forest. DNA forensic technology had advanced in the decades since the dark crime, and the investigators made a dark discovery that would change everything about the haunting, unsolved cold case. Blood from each of the murdered victims, Maila, Anja, and Seppo, was found as dark forensic evidence on the shoes of Niels Gustafsson. Gustafsson was formally charged with 3 dark counts of murder in the cold case. In 2005, a Finnish district court delivered its chilling verdict in the dark mystery. The judge ruled the forensic evidence was insufficient to convict. Niels Gustafsson walked free from the dark courtroom, and the dark cold case of the Lake Bodom murders returned to being permanently unsolved in the shadows. Here is what makes this dark cold case different from every other horror story you have ever heard. Not the violence in the dark tent, not the lack of forensic evidence, not even the mysterious lone survivor. It is the dark and chilling details that no theory has ever fully explained in 6 decades of investigation. The canvas tent was slashed open from the cold dark outside. This means the unknown attacker stood in the dark pine forest outside the tent in the cold night. But 2 of the victims were found outside the torn tent on the collapsed dark canvas in the cold morning. If the dark attacker cut in from outside the tent, how did the victims end up outside in the cold horror? No one has ever given a satisfying answer to this dark and chilling mystery. The dark attacker used at minimum 2 separate weapons in the horror: a bladed instrument and a blunt weapon. Neither dark weapon was ever found. Not in the cold lake, not in the dark, silent forest, not in any search conducted in 60 years. In the dark years of the 1960s, a violent criminal named Pentti Soininen confessed to the horror at Lake Bodom to a fellow inmate in a dark prison cell. He had lived in the shadows near the dark lake. He was placed near the isolated dark crime scene. There was one dark problem. Pentti Soininen was only 14 years old on the cold, dark night of the murders. Pentti Soininen hanged himself alone in his dark prison cell on June 6, 1969, the 9th dark anniversary of the horror at Lake Bodom. The dark cold water of Lake Bodom is still there. The dark pine forest still surrounds the isolated silent shore. Families visit the dark lake in summer. Children swim in the cold black water. The eerie pine trees still line the haunted shore. The dark horror of what happened there on the cold night of June 4, 1960, remains completely unsolved in the shadows. Somewhere in the dark world, there is a man, now in his dark 50s or 60s, carrying the cold horror of what he did in the darkness. Who knows exactly what dark horror happened on that isolated cold shore on the night of June 4th, 1960. He carries that dark knowledge every single cold day. He knows why he chose those teenagers in the dark, isolated forest. He knows how he approached the dark, silent tent in the cold night. He knows where he disappeared into the dark, cold forest when the grey dawn broke. And for 64 cold, dark years, he has said nothing from the shadows. The dark, cold lake of Bodom holds its silence better than anyone. This is not a case about forensic evidence or dark crime scene clues. This is a dark case about what a cold summer night in a silent forest can take from you and never give back.